I want to be clear about something before I read you this file. My name is Arthur Pendelton. I have worked for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency for 11 years. Before that, I spent 3 years as a records clerk for the War Department in Washington, which is how I first learned that certain files, certain very specific files, have a way of disappearing before they can be properly archived. Not lost, not misfiled, disappeared. There is a difference, and after enough years in this work, you learn to feel that difference, the way a ship captain feels weather before it arrives. I track those files. That is my particular specialty. Not murderers, not railroad thieves, not strike breakers. I track the reports that someone decided the public should never read. Most of what I find is what you would expect. Corruption, incompetence that got men killed, political arrangements that could not survive daylight. The machinery of government doing what machinery of government does, which is protect itself above all other things. But sometimes, not often, I want to emphasize that, not often, I find something that I cannot explain through incompetence or corruption or political convenience. Something that was suppressed not because it was embarrassing, suppressed because the people who witnessed it did not have language for what they would seen. This file is one of those. I have been sitting with it for 6 weeks. 6 weeks trying to decide whether to add it to my personal archive or burn it. 6 weeks waking up at 2 in the morning, turning it over in my mind. 6 weeks trying to find the rational explanation that I am certain must exist somewhere. I have not found it yet. The file is designated Army Medical Corps, classified dispatch, reference number 1864, KS90. The classification is, well, I am going to skip over the technical designation because it uses language I have only seen on 2 other documents in my career, and I would rather not speak that designation aloud. Let us just say it's the kind of classification that means this document was never supposed to be read by anyone who was not already dead. I will explain what that means as I go. The account begins in October of 1864, late autumn. The war was still on, another 6 months before Appomattox, though nobody knew that then. The Union Army was running hospital ships on the Mississippi River, which was standard practice by that point in the war. You know what a hospital ship is. A steamboat converted to carry the wounded, staffed by surgeons and nurses, ferrying injured men from the battle lines to proper medical facilities further back. The river was the fastest way to move large numbers of wounded. The ships were marked with red crosses. Under the rules of war, they were not to be fired upon by either side. The Annabelle Grace was one of those ships. She was a side-wheel steamboat, built in Cincinnati in 1858, requisitioned by the Army in 1862, 230 tons, 140 feet long. She'd done 2 years of runs on the Mississippi by the time this account begins, ferrying wounded from the campaigns around Vicksburg, from the battle lines in Tennessee. Her head surgeon was a man named Dr. Harlan Coombs. The file contains his credentials. Graduated from the Ohio Medical College in 1951, 13 years of practice before the war, by all accounts. And the file does contain accounts from colleagues. A steady man, methodical, not given to panic or exaggeration. I want you to hold on to that. Methodical, not given to panic or exaggeration. Because what Coombs wrote in the final pages of Ship's medical logbook is the part of this file that tops file that I cannot stop thinking about. But I am getting ahead of myself. The file requires a certain order. In late October of 1864, a farmer named Silas Burnett was plowing a field on his property outside of Abilene, Kansas. The field had been producing poorly for 2 seasons, and Burnett was turning over the soil to replant. The field was, I'm looking at the topographical notes in the file, approximately 340 miles from the Mississippi River, flat land, dry. The kind of Kansas terrain that has never, in recorded history, seen navigable water. His plow struck something. He thought, at first, it was rock. That happens in Kansas. You hit buried limestone, chunks of it, big enough to crack a plow blade, and work around it. Burnett went around it, but the obstacle was too large to work around. 40 feet across, maybe more. He could not find the edges. He sent his son to town to fetch the marshal. The marshal came out, looked at the disturbed earth, and sent a telegram to the army outpost at Fort Leavenworth. The army sent a small survey team. The survey team took one look at what Burnett's plow had partially uncovered, and the survey team sent an urgent telegram back to Fort Leavenworth. Fort Leavenworth sent an excavation crew, 22 men with shovels and picks, and eventually a steam-powered digging apparatus. They worked for 4 days. What they uncovered was the hull of a large wooden steamboat, buried approximately 8 feet below the surface of a Kansas cornfield. The hull was mostly intact. The wood was rotted in places, but recognizable. The sidewheel paddle housings were still attached. Along the upper hull, partially obscured by soil and damage, was a faded red cross. It was a hospital ship. The file contains a survey report filed by the Army engineer who oversaw the excavation, a Captain Marcus Dell. Dell was, again, the file includes credentials, an experienced engineer who'd spent the previous 2 years overseeing bridge construction and fortification work, a practical man. The kind of man who writes survey reports in the flat, technical language of someone who has looked at a great many things and is in the habit of describing what he sees without embellishment. His survey report is 23 pages long. The first 16 pages describe the excavation in that flat, technical language, dimensions, depth, condition and materials, structural integrity assessments. The last 7 pages are different. I have read those 7 pages many times now. The handwriting changes, not dramatically. Captain Dell did not suddenly become a different person, but if you have read enough official documents, and I have read thousands, you learn to recognize the moment when the professional distance fails, when what a person is actually experiencing starts bleeding through the formal language. That moment comes. On page 17, I will read you what he wrote. This is direct transcription. On the 4th day of excavation, when sufficient earth had been removed to allow access, a team of 6 entered the vessel through an opening created in the upper hull. The interior of the vessel was in a state of unexpected preservation. The air inside was dry and still. The surgical theater was intact. Tables bolted to the deck in the standard military configuration. Instruments laid out in orderly arrangement. Oil lamps containing fuel, though not lit. Supply cabinets holding bandages, medical spirits, and standard surgical supplies. The condition of these materials suggested they had not been exposed to moisture. No significant deterioration was observed. That is the professional language, flat, observational. Then, 2 paragraphs later, I find myself at a loss to explain the atmosphere inside the vessel. I'm a practical man, and I do not use the following word lightly. The surgical theatre felt inhabited, not inhabited by any person nor animal that we could identify, but the arrangement of everything inside, the instruments laid out as if for an operation about to begin, the lamps trimmed and ready, the logbook open on the surgeon's desk to what appeared to be a recent entry, suggested recent occupation, rather than a vessel that had been underground for a significant period. Recent occupation, 8 feet underground. 340 miles from the nearest river. Dell's report continues. The excavation team explored the upper decks of the vessel. They found the crew quarters, the officer's cabin, the small galley kitchen, all of them in the same state of preservation. All of them arranged as if the people who lived there had simply stepped out for a moment and would be returning shortly. Then Dell writes about the logbook. The medical logbook was recovered from the surgeon's desk in the main cabin. It was in good condition, the pages yellowed but legible. The logbook contained entries spanning from June 1862 through, according to the final dated entry, October 19th, 1864. This date, if accurate, would place the final log entry approximately 10 days prior to the farmer's plow striking the hull, and would require explanation as to how a vessel active on the Mississippi River as of October 19th, Mississippi River, as of October 19th, Mississippi River, as of October 19th, Mississippi River, as of October 19th, Mississippi River. He goes on. The logbook has been secured and forwarded to Army Medical Corps headquarters per standard protocol for recovered military materials. I have, for the purposes of this report, reviewed the final entries, and then Dell transcribes them. I am going to read you what Dr. Harlan Coombs wrote, the steady man, the methodical man, not given to panic or exaggeration. The entry from October 16th, 1864, is normal, routine, the kind of entry you would expect from an army surgeon on a hospital run. He notes the ship's position on the Mississippi. He notes the number of patients aboard, 47, he writes, including 11 in the quarantine ward. He notes the weather as clear and cool. He notes that Corporal Elias Marsh in bed 6 has shown improvement and may be fit for light duty within the month. The entry from October 17th is also normal. Position noted. Patient roster updated. The weather, he writes, says stern strange, a yellowish haze on the horizon to the northwest, unusual for this time of year. He does not dwell on it. October 8th. The fog has come upon us more rapidly than anticipated. Thick yellow-gray, unlike anything in my experience. Visibility reduced to perhaps 30 feet in any direction. Captain Holloway has slowed the engines to half and posted extra men at the bow. The river has grown very quiet. No other vessel traffic visible. The fog has a quality I'm struggling to describe. It muffles sound in a way that ordinary fog does not. Our own engine sounds distant to me. I have noticed several members of the crew standing at the rails staring into it. I advise them to step back from the rails. October 19th. This is the last entry. I'm going to read this slowly because Dell copied it exactly, and the detail in it matters. I write this entry not knowing if it will be found or read by anyone with the capacity to understand what I am describing. If you are reading this, I ask that you take it as a report of a sober medical officer who has, in 11 years of practice, never before written anything he did not believe to be true. The fog did not lift. It thickened through the night of the 18th and into the morning of the 19th. At approximately 7 in the morning, I became aware of a change in the sound of the vessel. The paddle wheels, which normally throw up a considerable churning noise, began to sound different, muffled, as if moving through something thicker than water. I went on deck. The river was not there. I want to be precise about this. The water was not gone. It was changing. As I watched, the surface of the river around the hull was becoming solid, not frozen. It was not cold enough to freeze. It was becoming solid in the way that mud becomes solid when it dries, except that it was not mud. It was, as far as I could observe, river water becoming earth, soil, dark Kansas soil, the kind you find 100 miles west of the river. The ship was still moving forward. I want to emphasize this. The paddle wheels were still turning. The engines were still running. The vessel was moving forward, or what felt like forward, through what was no longer water, through what was, as near as I could determine, becoming ground, dry ground. The resistance increased gradually rather than suddenly. Captain Holloway gave the order to abandon the vessel. I do not know whether the crew was able to comply. I returned below decks to my patients. By the time I reached the surgical theater, the motion had stopped. The lamps were still burning. The instruments were still laid out. Everything was as it should be, except that there was no sound of water anywhere, and the portholes, when I uncovered them, showed nothing but dark earth pressed against the glass. I have checked on the patients in the main ward. They are frightened, but physically stable. The quarantine ward I cannot reach. The doors appeared to have been secured from the outside. I can hear the entry ends there. Mid-sentence, Captain Dell notes in his report that this is where the transcription ends. The remaining pages of the logbook are blank. There is no further explanation from Dr. Coombs, no indication of what he heard, no indication of what happened next. The report continues with what the excavation team found when they reached the quarantine ward. I need to pause before I read this section. I have read a great many documents in my career that describe terrible things. War produces terrible things, and the documents of war describe them with varying degrees of honesty. I have read field reports from Antietam. I have read the affidavits from Andersonville. I have developed, over the years, a certain capacity to hold difficult information at arm's length, to read it professionally rather than personally. This section of Dell's report I have not been able to hold at arm's length. I have tried. The quarantine ward was below the main surgical deck. It was a separate compartment, accessible by a narrow stairway. The door at the bottom of the stairway was a heavy iron door, hospital grade, the kind designed to isolate patients who posed a contagion risk. It was chained shut. The chains were on the outside. Dell notes this carefully. The chains were on the outside of the door. The locks were the standard Army Medical Corps pattern. The excavation team had to cut through the chains to open the door. 11 men had been in that ward. The logbook's October 16th entry names them. Dell lists their names in his report, cross-referenced with the medical roster. The ward, when the door was opened, contained 11 beds. Each bed was made, sheets pulled up, tucked in. On each bed was a Union Army uniform, complete, jacket, trousers, undergarments. Buttoned up, Dell writes, every button fastened, the jackets laid flat on top of the sheets, the trousers below, the boots at the foot of the beds. The arrangement of each uniform was, in his words, as if someone had removed the clothing carefully and then reassembled it in the shape of a person lying down, but without anyone inside it. The medical bandages were still in place, wrapped in the correct positions, sitting inside the empty sleeves and trouser legs, clean. Dell writes that word and underlines it, which is something that in 23 pages of formal engineering report he does nowhere else. Clean. The bandages were clean, as if whatever injuries they would been dressed to treat had simply stopped. There were no remains, no marks on the floor or walls, no sign of what had happened to 11 men in a locked room. Dell writes, I have no explanation for the condition of the quarantine ward. I have recorded what I observed. I leave the interpretation to those with the authority and capacity to provide one. The last section of the file is brief. It is a signed order from a brigadier general, whose name I have seen on exactly 2 other suppressed files, and both of those files concerned events I would rather not discuss in this context. The order is dated October 30th, 1864, the day after the excavation reached the quarantine ward. It authorizes the immediate destruction by fire of the Annabel Grace, the excavated site, and all materials recovered from the vessel, excepting the logbook and Dell's report, which are to be classified and archived under restricted access. The order notes that farmer Silas Burnett and his family were relocated at government expense to a property in Missouri. No explanation given, just relocated. Captain Dell. I have tried to trace him. He appears in Army records through early November of 1864, and then nothing. Transferred to an unspecified posting, the records say. I have never been able to find what posting. The 6 men who entered the vessel on that 4th day of excavation, I'd traced 2 of them. One died in 1871, cause of death listed as unspecified illness. The other I located in a veterans' home in Pennsylvania. In 1987, I visited him. He was not well, had not been well, the attendants told me, since long before he arrived there. He recognized that I was there to ask about Kansas, about the ship. I did not have to say the words. He looked at me for a long time before he spoke. He said, the smell inside was the thing. The rest of it, instruments, the logbook, the uniforms, I have made peace with not understanding those things. But the smell, it did not smell like a ship. It did not smell like earth. It smelled like, he stopped. He started over. I grew up on a farm. I know the smell of a field in the morning, that clean smell when the dew is still on everything and the sun's just coming up. That is what it smelled like, inside that ship. Like a field at dawn. Like nothing had ever been wrong, anywhere. He passed away 3 months after I visited him. He was the last of the 6 I was able to locate. I have spent 6 weeks with this file, and I keep coming back to the same details, not the fog. Not the impossible location of a hospital ship in a Kansas cornfield, not even the empty uniforms in the locked ward. I keep coming back to 2 things. First, the chains were on the outside of the door. Someone locked those 11 men in. Someone aboard that ship, in the middle of whatever was happening to the river around them, and the decision to chain that door shut from the outside. Was it Dr. Coombs? He was the ranking officer below decks when the engines stopped. He wrote that he could hear something, and then stopped writing. What did he hear? Second, Dell's report notes that when the excavation team opened the quarantine ward, the oil lamp inside was still burning, still lit after, however many days the ship had been in the ground. The fuel reserve, by Dell's calculation, should not have lasted that long, but it was burning, a lit lamp in a sealed room with 11 empty uniforms in the shape of sleeping men. The army burned the site the following morning, the cornfield, the ship, whatever remained. Silas Burnett and his family were moved to Missouri, and the government paid for their new property in full and never, as far as I can determine, told them why. The Annabel Grace does not appear in the official records of Mississippi River hospital ships. I checked. The records show she operated through mid-October of 1864, and then the record simply skips, as if someone cut a page from a ledger and filled in the gap by moving the dates on either side slightly closer together. 47 men were aboard that ship on October 16th. 11 of them were in the quarantine ward. The other 36, the crew, the other patients, Captain Holloway, Dr. Coombs, are not accounted for anywhere in the file. They are not listed as casualties. They are not listed as survivors. They are simply not listed. There is a word for that, in my experience. I have been sitting with this file for 6 weeks. I have been trying to find the rational explanation that a practical person should be able to find. Engine failure and subsequent grounding on a buried sandbar, except there is no river for 300 miles. A hoax, a staged scene, except the wood will not be around long enough to show weathering, and you cannot fake the smell of soil. A mass desertion, except deserters do not usually leave their boots behind. I have tried every angle. I put the file away last Tuesday, and I thought I was done with it. Then Tuesday night I woke up at 2 in the morning, and I could not get back to sleep, and after an hour of lying there in the dark, I understood why. The smell. That veteran in the Pennsylvania home. The field at dawn. That clean smell when the dew is still on everything. I grew up in Ohio. I know that smell too. And here is what I have not been able to stop thinking about since Tuesday at 2 in the morning. That is not the smell of something terrible happening. That is the smell of something ending, of something being, in whatever sense the word applies to things I do not have language for, finished. Whatever took those men, whatever passed through that quarantine ward and left 11 sets of empty clothes buttoned up in 11 beds, laid out neat as a Sunday morning, it was done with them. The file goes back into the archive tomorrow. Some questions, I have learned, are not puzzles to be solved. They are weights to be carried. You carry them long enough. You learn the shape of them. You learn which part of your thinking to keep them away from, so they do not do too much damage. But every so often, in the quiet hours, you take them out and look at them again. And you remember that somewhere in Kansas, in a field that grew nothing but winter wood for 20 years after the army left, the earth is still there, just earth now. But the shape of something is still in it, if you know what to look for, the impression of a keel. A long, flat absence in the soil where something was, and then was not, and never should have been there at all. I filed this report. I am going home. I am going to sleep with the light on.